I'm very excited to introduce today Renovations Toronto, who are here as Patricio Dávila and Philip Zigman. This is a project that is, the anti-addiction mapping has been very inspiring for us here in Montreal. So this is a volunteer-run project that asks tenants to anonymously report their landlords to help document evictions by renovations in Toronto. And we'll hear more about this from Philip and Patricio. So Patricio Dávila is a designer, artist, and researcher and educator. He's also associate professor at York University and is one of the core members of the Public Visualization Lab and the Science Applications VISTA project at York University. Philip, I'm sorry, Philip. Philip is an activist based in Toronto who does housing justice, and perhaps you can add a bit more. I'm sorry, I don't know more about you, but welcome both.
I anticipated that a little bit because of the miscommunication, but I've worked with Philip for a few years, and we'll talk a little bit about the origin story. Not that that's what the workshop about, but Phil, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
I mean, that's fine. Based in Toronto, tenant organizer, and like Patricio said, helped create this project, this tool with him, and I've been involved in the project.
So thanks so much for joining me today. It's really exciting to be here, and with Phil, we were thinking about what to present, how to present it, and inevitably it turns into a kind of a presentation. It's a bit of a show and tell. I'm going to try to go through the guts of the site and how it works technically. First, because it's interesting on a technical level, but also to demystify it hopefully a little bit, and how it may work as a free, based on free software, based on open source software, based on like minimal infrastructure, so that it makes this kind of project possible. I wanted to mention one thing, that there's two books that I, over the past 2-3 years, edited and co-authored, Diagrams of Power. This is this. It's not for sale. It's like the last copy right now. But this one's a gift to Alexander. And also critical visualization that just came out with Bloomsbury. This is recorded, I guess, but if you want it, I can give you PDFs. So that's like if you're interested. But if you have the cash, you can buy them where you can. I kind of wanted to also have the talk bounce between the actual organizing and then and the site. So between the technical, between how to create this kind of tool, but also how it gets implemented very directly. With Phil, we met, was it like 3 years ago? Or it was before the pandemic, correct?
Yeah, a few months before.
A few months before the pandemic. And Phil was going to take a picture of the coffee shop where we went to, but I probably like it a little too much. But we got together through a mutual friend, Vincent Lee, who is a documentary filmmaker and a professor at OCADU University, who knew both of us and knew of our shared interests. This project started out of a little bit of a failure. I finished my PhD and I was like, I'm not going to do anything for the next year or two, just kind of trying to like relax. But the pressures of academia was such that they asked you to apply for grants to bring in money. And so I did, based on part of what I was trying to think through in my dissertation. And so I got a little bit of SSHRC money, Social Science and Humanities Research Council money. And the idea was to go to Parkdale. I live right on the border of Parkdale. And that's where my parents used to live. And so I knew that there was a lot of a long history of activism and a lot of continued threat over the decades of gentrification in that neighborhood. So I thought some kind of participatory mapping project would make sense in that situation. But I quickly learned that I didn't know enough people. Burdening people with participation in a mapping project was something that I wasn't prepared to negotiate at the moment, because I hadn't sort of created a sense of trust with people. And also, although there's long-term residents there, there's also like a flow of people that go there and then move somewhere else, because there's a few spots within Toronto where people land when they first arrive in Toronto. So Parkdale is one of them. And so there is a lot of movement in the neighborhood. And so what I opted to do was I took the research funds and I started handing it out basically to people who were already in the neighborhood, who were already doing workshops. And it kind of had to do with mapping, but more about helping build capacity within the structures that already existed. So there was a little bit of like hubris at the beginning, and then there was this sort of realization that I didn't have the things that I needed in order to make a positive contribution to what was happening in the neighborhood. But out of that, Bill and I got introduced to each other, and he had a particular notion about how to organize and the role that data would play in that. So do you want to sort of talk about that impetus?
Yeah, I think, as there is now, at the time, there was, a lot of discussion in Toronto about the issue of renovictions, about, certainly lack of data around it, but also around tenants starting to organize in response. So there was definitely an interest in developing a tool that could be useful for tenants, that could support tenant organizing, and maybe could help document what was happening along the lines of some of the anti-eviction mapping projects that exist in the States. But yeah, kind of like was said, having an interest in doing something or having some thoughts about it, if you're not kind of involved in the communities that have been organizing to fight renoviction or that have been experiencing it, it's not something you could just kind of create out of thin air and, put into the world and expect people to engage with it or for even what you create to be useful. So I think once we met and talked about the idea of this sort of project, the work was figuring out what would be useful to tenants, what would be useful for organizing, what information did people need to have, making sure that no one else was in the middle of producing a similar tool at the same time, and we weren't just duplicating other people's work. And then, working with people who had experience to try to develop something that could hopefully be useful to people.
Yeah, I think I started someone I was talking to yesterday about this site becoming a tool, becoming what sometimes is termed within the software industry, the minimal viable product, like something where you build little pieces and see how it works before planning a massive thing, a massive site or a massive application, where you do a lot of planning, but you're going to eventually learn through its delivery or deployment. And so for us, we had very specific ideas of what needed to happen. And that was to have a place where people can contribute information, represent the information visually, and offer the information for people to look up. That was it. So that was like very modest. So I've been a huge fan and massively impressed and inspired by Aaron's work and your collective for so long. And it's so big and so comprehensive. And where we were starting work was like this little sliver of one thing to do this one thing. And so as soon as our conversation spread into how do we put in more stories or more representation or more of the wins that happen within the struggle against eviction, we couldn't see the immediate payoff. Like we of course recognize the payoff like longer term, but in like, how do we organize next week? How do people organize next week? We didn't have the resources, but also we had to focus on the thing that would lead to the next thing, like Renovate. We're still talking about like, do we or don't we add more things? But it goes up against this calculus of like, what resources do we have? Who's there to do it? And how do we sustain it over a long period of time? Yeah, so this is the website, and it's really simple. It's like a landing page telling you what is the issue. If you're going there already, you know what the issue is, but we felt like, okay, let's just make sure like these are the things that we're covering. And there's reports, which we'll get into a little bit. There's, there's 2 reports that you can download. And this tends not to be for tenants who are facing eviction right away. It's more for maybe a specialized audience that needs to report on things or help analysis. There's a Know Your Rights. We talked about this as well. These 2 parts weren't actually in the initial idea of the site, but we felt like we needed to contextualize a little bit of what we were doing with some information. And then there's a map, and we can select what kinds of eviction issues are being tracked. We have a tracker, which offers you a way of searching for a landlord, searching for location, searching for a type of issue, which is one of the 3 issues that we track. And then our most, I guess I keep it, maybe I should have started here, but it kind of works this way. It's a form that we ask people to fill out. And it's I'm a little embarrassed because it's so dead simple that it's very purpose built. But there's something, would you agree, Phil, that even the menus, it's kind of like warming you up from left to right, like home, this is what we are, these are some reports. So some people involved in the project know what they're talking and they're committed to this kind of analysis. You should know your rights. And so before you start figuring out other things that you might have to do, like see what legally is within your power, see what other people are doing, get a little bit more information. And if you are having this issue, contribute to it. So. Yeah.
I think we didn't want to just be like, are you getting rent evicted? Tell us about it. Because you gotta, if you're asking people for information, and also it's not just asking for information, but, encouraging people to reach out if they're interested in organizing, you have to, I think, provide them with something, a reason to trust you, show some indication that you are involved with other tenants who have been fighting, that you have some credibility. I think that was really important.
Yeah, the credibility, we noticed as we were doing it that, first we had, what kind of data did we get from? We got it from the LTV, from the Landlord and Tenant Board.
So you could see on the report now, like the website focuses on rent eviction, but we also look at above guideline rent increases, which are kind of something that are related but distinct. It's where landlords do extensive renovations and then apply for big rent increases that end up, displacing tenants because they can't afford the rent increases. So it's not, the displacement pressure isn't quite as acute as with rent eviction, but we thought it was kind of a family resemblance and something we wanted to bring attention to. And fortunately, the data around above guideline rent increases is really good because landlords have to apply to the Landlord and Tenant Board. So we had a huge data set of AGI applications that we could put up on the website before launching, which kind of, showed that we had some information or something to offer, that we weren't just, trying to get information from tenants without providing anything. We also track own use evictions, which are, sometimes there's a gray area between renoviction and own use evictions, but numbers 2 and 3 on that list, the data around there is a little bit trickier to collect from official sources like the landlord and tenant board, because so many of them happen informally and there's no paper trail. So we had some data about a dozen or so renovictions that had, taken place in Toronto before the site launched, that we either heard about from tenants we spoke to while developing the project, or that had made it into the news. So before launching, we had some data up there. So it wasn't just a blank map asking people to submit stuff.
And we found that was a dynamic, in retrospect, that was really helpful to garner people's trust. It's basically that there's people before you. There's information before you make the leap to potentially identify yourself in your situation. One thing that I should make clear is that and Phil and others like Cole Weber, at the very bottom, there's a ask us, like feedback, questions, and people reach out through this email address when they're facing eviction. And so what Phil does is he takes this, fields the questions, but also basically starts helping them organize at their particular building.
So the website, there's information, there's the map, there's the tracker, but a big part of it is the reporting tool, which not only helps us collect data, but helps us connect with tenants who are facing renoviction. So, and this is, I think, something that developed more as the project continued, realizing that there was maybe more work to do there than we suspected. So if tenants are facing renoviction and they report to our website, they don't need to leave any contact information. The amount of information that we require people to include in a report is very minimal. But if they do want to organize or do have questions, they can leave contact information, or they can email us or even reach out through Twitter. Any tenants who submit a report through the website where they leave contact information, will follow up and ask if they have any questions or if they're interested in organizing. And typically, if tenants are interested in organizing, what we do is try to arrange a group meeting at the building with all of their neighbors, or as many neighbors as possible. And, typically try to have a couple of organizers there, if possible, even other tenants from the neighborhood who have fought renoviction before or who are experiencing renoviction. And we try to set up a meeting at the building with everyone at the building to talk about, what's happening. This is what the eviction process is like, and this is how you can organize to fight. And if people are interested in organizing to fight, then we try to support them as much as we can. So yeah, those are some pictures. That's a picture of a rally from a building in York South Weston. That was actually the first building that had reached out to us to report a renoviction that was active. When we first launched the site, there were a lot of people who reported stuff that had kind of happened over the past few years that they wanted to have up on the map. But this was the first one that reached out right after they had received N13 notices. So we met with them at the building, tenants got organized. This is a picture from a rally they had at the building, and the tenants there who stayed and fought were successful in having the eviction notices withdrawn prior to any landlord and tenant board hearings. And they managed to, so they're still there. The two people on the right are the tenants who stayed, Glenn and Tamina. They're still in their homes. They're still paying the same rent they were paying before. All the other apartments in the building were renovated and the rent was doubled, but they're doing well. And that was kind of our first experience with the project supporting tenants. Of course, a lot of other organizers were involved in that, and a lot of other tenant groups in the city helped. And a lot of those people had prior experience, organizing to fight renoviction, but that was the first building that RenovictionsTO was involved with.
one thing that happened early on is through word of mouth, other projects, other initiatives asked to copy the model that we had. So there was Renovictions Hamilton and also COVID evictions.
Yeah.
Which were smaller projects just to get like a snapshot of what's going on and in order to help organize right around that particular issue. We've had ideas of sharing code a little bit more, but there isn't this one project and one set of code, and then you just kind of install it and then it goes. It's and this is why I use this kind of presentation software. It's all connected. So for these other initiatives, we basically volunteered just to set up their web server, put on all the different things, and basically so that it works. One thing that we felt was important is that it was minimal maintenance. And I mentioned this before, but the way that we wanted to do it is like we build it. We kind of make sure things are updated, and then it just works. It just kind of works as a tool. And before our like checking in on the back end of the website this week, I realized that we hadn't really gone. I mean, Phil, you've gone in for content a little bit, but in terms of maintenance code, we haven't touched it for about 2 years, which is pretty good, actually. And there's a certain amount of updating that we will need to do, but we do it very carefully because as soon as you update something, the possibility of breaking something goes up, right? If it's not broken, don't touch it.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to just scroll all the way to the last picture in the? Yeah. So that picture here, this is taken after like a building meeting, the first meeting that we had at a building on Keele Street. Everyone in the building got N13 notices. This was, I guess, a year into the pandemic, but during one of the waves where we were back on lockdown, from what I remember. But so we had a meeting at the building. All the apartments were represented, talked about the situation. Neighbors made a plan for how to respond to the landlord. Tenants at that building ended up successfully organizing. The landlord withdrew the eviction notices. Then several months later, the landlord issued eviction N13 notices to 3 of the tenants for some reason. Tenants once again had meetings like this in the building, got together, organized, put pressure on the landlord who withdrew the eviction notices and has since changed their business. So they're no longer buying up buildings and rent-evicting people as they had previously. So that was a really successful campaign. That building's in North York at Keele and Lawrence in Toronto. And the really interesting thing too about that building is that after those tenants organized and beat rent eviction, a lot of them have gotten involved in an organizing initiative in their neighborhood. So for example, the other pictures are from a building a couple of blocks away on Lawrence West, where tenants there are still fighting their rent eviction. But tenants from 2419 Keele have, supported that fight, came out to early meetings at the other building, talked about their struggle, and have really been instrumental in, helping other tenants in the neighborhood organize to try to keep their homes. So those are just some pictures from different actions that tenants at 1570 Lawrence have engaged in. Their landlord's a little bit bigger and has a lot more resources, so their fight has been a little bit more difficult, but they've been doing great work to put pressure on them and fight for their homes.
One thing that we discussed though was how some of the most effective organizing happens before it goes to tribunal, and that kind of pressure is that's where a lot of the strategies work best, because because there's a difference about public opinion and outside the constraints of the tribunal process, right?
Yeah, and I think that in a way goes back to like the original development of the project and the tool. Like there's, like Patricio mentioned, the Know Your Rights page, I don't think that was something we initially thought we would put together. But then when we looked around at what information was out there around renoviction, a lot of it was being provided by legal clinics or by housing rights nonprofits. And often their information is, very legal focused on the legal process, and typically quite conservative. So, it is legal for landlords in Toronto or in Ontario to issue N13 notices and evict tenants for extensive renovations. And once you're evicted, we have not heard of a single case of a tenant returning after the renovations are completed, which is kind of obvious. This is a tactic landlords use to permanently displace people to raise rent. No landlord is doing, $50,000 of renovations in a unit to welcome back an old tenant paying $1,000 for a 2-bedroom. So we felt the need to put out useful information that wasn't available elsewhere. And that's to working with organizers and tenants who had experienced renoviction, finding out what they wanted to know or what they would have liked to know before getting their N13 notices or before moving out. That's kind of what informed the content on the website. And the main idea or the main strategy is to organize outside of the legal process to try to put pressure on landlords to withdraw the evictions prior to them reaching a hearing at the landlord and tenant board, because the landlord and tenant board is a landlord friendly arena. And given that what landlords are doing is technically speaking legal, we think it's prudent not to rely on that process when trying to keep your home. So whereas a lot of legal clinics and other tenant resources might downplay organizing and encourage tenants to get a legal clinic lawyer and just try to challenge it at the board. We encourage tenants to organize and put pressure on their landlord before that happens. And that's where we see tenants have had the most success. And never mind, the stress and everything that goes along with living in your place while you're facing eviction. Even just, when it comes to outcomes and people's ability to stay in their homes, we found that organizing outside the legal process is much more effective. Basically, the organizing that, has resulted from the project is independent collective direct action. So tenants in a building organizing together, organizing independently of politicians or nonprofits or any other agencies or stuff like that, and directly confronting their landlords, whether that means going to their offices, going to their homes, going to their affiliated businesses, directly confronting landlords to exert as much pressure on them as possible to try to get them to back down. Because at the end of the day, renoviction is just about landlords seeking to make as much money as possible. So if you raise the costs of what they're doing high enough, they might reconsider whether it's worth it for them. I think for one reason, I think we've been lucky. And if you search renovictions or N13s in Toronto, then we're one of the first sites that come up, despite no effort on our part to make that happen. So that's at least what I've been told. Maybe I'll be proven wrong live, but okay. So I think, so we do, I think some people find us online, some kind of legal clinics or other groups might, include our information in some materials they give to tenants. We do a lot of proactive outreach, whether flyering buildings that have recently been sold or that are for sale or that we think are at risk of renoviction. We put up a lot of posters early on in certain parts of the city. Early on, there was a lot more effort to get the word out. Now we get a lot, unfortunately, of reports. So we don't really have much time to do a proactive outreach, nor the capacity to take on that work. In terms of the earlier questions, like it's a little, the project we started working on the project before the pandemic started, but then by the time we launched, Keep Your Rent was up and running in Toronto. And I think, the COVID eviction stuff was really dominating the tenant organizing scene and dominating the headlines, and rightly so. There was a lot of activity around tenant organizing in the early days of the pandemic. So at that time, I think it was a lot easier for us to, find tenant organizers in different parts of the city who might be interested in supporting, or to find tenants who might be willing to support actions. Since then, a lot of that stuff has kind of died down. A lot of groups have had have either kind of dissolved or kind of lost a lot of capacity. So we kind of get reports from people all over the city. This is happening, I think, more in certain parts of the city, that like the downtown areas. I think a lot of those buildings, tenants have already been pushed out, and now we're seeing a lot of renovictions in the inner suburbs. So whether that's, south of Etobicoke or North York or parts of Scarborough, that's where we see a lot of reports from. Some of those areas have existing groups. So, when things happen in Parkdale, there's Parkdale organized there. Like we don't even, like we know, we're in touch with people from that organization, but like it would be completely nonsensical for us to go there. They don't need support. Unfortunately, there aren't that many areas in the city that have existing tenant organizing. There's some groups that try to assist tenants when it comes to renoviction, but not a ton of them. So, there's a few other organizers who are involved in the project who will come out to meetings or join for actions. And then one of the things that I touched on a little bit that has kind of developed from the project is there's been like a cluster of buildings in North York in a like pretty close together that have faced renoviction recently, where tenants there have organized. And there's a lot of other buildings in the neighborhood that we know are, at risk of renoviction. So there's been some neighborhood organizing that's developed in that area as a result of the project. So tenants in that area will, join lobby meetings, come out to support other buildings in the area. So that's something that's kind of developed as a result of the project. But yeah, it's tough. Sometimes we'll reach out to people and hope they might be able to support, but there's not, unfortunately, there's not as much organizing going on in the city as we'd like, or as would be good to see. And honestly, there's also a question of, how other groups operate or how other organizations operate. Like there is certainly political parties or groups affiliated with political parties that, try to promote or encourage tenant organizing in Toronto, but they do so in a way that funnels people into the legal process or funnels people to depute at City Hall, and, fundamentally doesn't result in people being able to keep their homes and beat renoviction. So we're aware of those groups, but those aren't groups that we would encourage tenants to reach out to or that we would kind of work with. So that's also something I think that we have to consider. Like we do follow up with everybody, and we will meet with anyone at their building who is facing renoviction, who is interested in having a group meeting at their building. But yeah, to kind of support or be involved in a prolonged campaign, sometimes we have to be a little bit more selective and kind of look at, geography, what other groups exist in the area, stuff like that. It's a little tricky too to be able to say for sure kind of what the impact is, because a lot of this isn't really black and white. So much of these evictions are informal. One thing we touch on in the report that kind of came out of our experience with a lot of buildings is it's hard to know exactly what landlords' genuine plans are. I mean, from what I understand, things are similar in Montreal. Like sometimes you'll have a landlord that tells people you got to move out because we're renovating, and all they're planning to do is slap on a coat of paint and put it up as an Airbnb or bring in new tenants. Sometimes you have a landlord that sincerely intends to gut the building, renovate it entirely and bring in new tenants. So it's hard to know kind of what their actual plans are, but it's also from our perspective irrelevant for tenants. You should fight to keep your home regardless of what your landlord's plans are. And when you do fight, your landlord's plans change. So there are some tenants who, their buildings were acquired by landlords who had previously renovicted people. They reached out to us, they got organized really early, and their landlord has never tried to issue them N13 notices. Can't say for sure that that's because they got organized early, but we do know that that's one way to deter renoviction. There's other cases where landlords gave tenants N13 notices. Tenants engaged in a campaign to put pressure on the landlord that got a lot of publicity, demonstrating at their homes, confronting them directly, getting negative attention around their businesses. And the landlord never escalated to file applications to evict them at the board. We can't say for sure that that's because of the organizing. It could be the landlord never intended to, but those are cases that we've been involved with where, tenants have organized and as a result, or can't say as a result, and still remain in their homes and weren't evicted. Then there's kind of the more extreme cases, if you will, like the ones that are up here where tenants got N13 notices, they organized, targeted their landlords' businesses, the businesses of their spouses, just like brought a lot of public pressure and public attention to the situation. And the landlords formally withdrew the eviction notices and either sold the building or just, have not since tried to evict tenants. So it's not always successful. The pictures in the middle there are those 4 photos of tenants from 1570. Like I mentioned, their landlord is like a huge REIT, basically, which is atypical for renoviction in Toronto. But they've, waged a pretty serious struggle. And as a result of that, the majority of the tenants who received N13 notices have not yet moved out, which in a way is something of a success already, because normally tenants move out pretty quickly. So the fact that these people are still in their homes, 9 months after they were supposed to be kicked out is, some small win. But those notices have not yet been withdrawn and they have hearings coming up at the board. So it doesn't always work. But what we've seen be most successful is raising the financial, physical, and social costs for landlords. And the only way to do that is direct action.